Hello, greetings from Chile, Chicago, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, the Senior Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host a conversation with Zhiguo He, Minxin Pei, and Susan Thornton, moderated by Jamil Anderlini, on the recent socio-economic developments in China and what challenges or opportunities may lie ahead. This is the first installment in our new series on China's political economy, which features scholars and experts to discuss the country's changing political economy environment and the potential domestic and international implications. Please sign up for our newsletter to stay in the loop about upcoming events. The link should be in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. And before we begin, please note we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will try to address them in the last 25 minutes or so. And you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars, so please check our website as well, our publication, promarket.org, and subscribe to our Capitalism podcast. Those links should be in the chat function as well. And now, please allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers. Zhiguo He is the Fuji Bank and Heller Professor of Finance and the Duke Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. Minxin Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker Professor of Government and the George Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Susan Thornton is a Senior Fellow and Visiting Lecturer at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. And last but not least, our moderator today is Jamil Anderlini, who is the Editor-in-Chief at POLITICO Europe. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I hope you can all hear me coming from Brussels. Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I'm coming to you from Brussels, from the POLITICO Europe headquarters here. I wanted to first turn to Susan, who sorry, I don't know, can you hear me? It's my internet is not great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll try. So I wanted to turn to Susan. I'm very interested in, especially given the events that are happening in this part of the world with Russia and Ukraine. I'm so interested in the relationship between US, China, and then Russia. If you look at after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the rationale for US-China relations really shifted. Previously, the two countries were working together really to contain Soviet power. And after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw the relationship shift to being much more about globalization and the joint pursuit of prosperity. And that really lasted, that compact lasted for a long time. But in more recent years, as China has really risen, you see a much more confrontational relationship between the two countries. And particularly with the rise of Xi Jinping, the US seems to have determined that China is really a threat to the US position in the world. Do you think that's the right way to think about China's challenge to the US, to other countries, and to the global system?
Well, yeah, thanks, Jamil, for this question, because I think it's really fundamental to our thinking today about China and about how the US is looking at sort of its relationship with China and its, in the context of its relations with other countries in the world. And certainly it's interesting to see what's going on in Russia right now, especially since the Biden administration has kind of pursued a narrative that talks about democracies being threatened by autocracies. And the two most frequently mentioned countries, of course, are China and Russia. Sometimes Iran is thrown in, and this is sort of seems to be an evolving new kind of, I don't know if axis of evil would be the right word, but axis of bad guys, let's say. And, you know, I think it's really an crude kind of simplification, oversimplification that has the potential to be actually quite dangerous, and to set a frame that could see us making a lot of mistakes as we proceed in the world. And, you know, I think what China wants, I mean, its focus is actually, it's pretty simple. Its focus is primarily about its own stability and development. And if we think about, you know, what China wants, you know, what are the things that would assist with that? And what are the things that would impede that? I think, of course, a well-ordered international system with minimal instability would assist with that. That would allow for China's development. It wants to keep connections with other economies to gain resources that it needs for its development. It wants a peaceful and prosperous neighborhood, because it has an awful lot of borders with other countries. I think it has the most borders with other countries of any other country in the world. So that is something that, you know, Americans don't often think about, but it makes their environment quite complicated. And I think, you know, they need tight internal controls from their perspective. And Minxin may say more about that, but that gets to the issue of sort of stability, both external and especially internal. And that is their view on that. On top of that, of course, China wants respect in the world. So the open question is whether China believes that it needs to dominate the world militarily and economically in order to achieve these things it wants: stability, development, and respect. Or would it be willing to settle for some kind of balance, you know, of sufficiency in these areas, combined with integration with other countries that would, you know, and the restraint that would go along with that, that would get it, you know, to achieve the sort of things that it needs. And I think most of Washington, at least the national security community, currently believes that it's the former, that China thinks it needs to dominate. Whereas I think if we look at sort of China's behavior, especially in the last 40 years, but also the way Chinese leaders think about sort of China's challenges and the future, I think it is possible that, and probably more than possible, probably probable, that China believes it could settle for some kind of sufficiency in terms of balancing its development and military power with restraints that would be imposed by an international system that it could still live with, but would allow it to get what it needs. And so I think, you know, that is sort of the key question. A lot of Americans are talking about China as this kind of pre-World War I or pre-World War II dynamic in Europe. I don't think that's a good framing. And I think it's, as I said earlier, kind of a dangerous framing that sort of rejects the last 70 years of global institution building. And I think it avoids complexity, and I think it'll lead us down a wrong path.
So what do you think is a much better approach then? How would you advise the current government, rather than seeing this as an inevitable conflict between China and the West? How would you ask them to frame things today?
Well, I mean, I think it's unlikely that we're going to change the framing in the near term, partly because I think the US is still adjusting to a lot of major transitions in the world, and also, we have to say, domestically. But I think, you know, what we should do is think about what responsibilities we would be willing to give to China in the current international system. In other words, the US has been the traditional provider of all kinds of different public goods in the international system, from, you know, security and stability with the US military and the US Navy patrolling the seas, to funding in the World Bank and the IMF, assistance money, all kinds of things. So are there things that we could trust China to do in some of these areas? In other words, give them some responsibilities, and at the same time come up with some arrangements and understandings on security issues that are clearer and more durable, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, which is what China cares about, than what currently exists. And I think we did this with the Soviet Union actually during détente. It would be very difficult in the current political environment in the US. And it's also hard because new technology kind of blurs the distinction between economic and military arenas right now. So it's kind of hard to make a distinction sometimes between economic and military measures. But I think a global order that leaves China out is not going to be sustainable or beneficial for the US or the rest of the world. And it's interesting to think about how next week is the 50th anniversary, we were talking before we got started here, of Nixon's visit to China. And a big part of Nixon's visit, of course, was his understanding that the international system would not be stable and durable unless China was brought in a way that could be managed. And I think, that's still the question really that we're struggling with today.
Yeah, very good point. Minxin, could I turn to you? I'm really interested in what you think Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping has really changed the narrative, changed the sort of discussion at home in China in many ways, and the discussion in China about how China should interact with the rest of the world. I was living in the mainland for the first 5 years, and I lived outside of in Hong Kong for the last 6 years, and I saw how much China changed and China's attitudes to the world changed in that time. What do you think, Minxin, that Xi Jinping is trying to accomplish politically at home?
Several things. First of all, it's great to see you, Jamil, and it's great to see my friend Susan and Zhiguo. He's at several levels. I think at home, first of all, at personal level, he would like to make himself not just the most powerful leader, but a leader that would stay on for an extended period of time in order to transform China. I agree with you that he has indeed changed China. China today is not the same country as 2012, right before he came to power. At another level, he would like to ensure that the Communist Party will continue to govern. He's quintessentially a party man in the sense that he has profound emotional, ideological attachment to the idea of the Communist Party's supremacy, but also perhaps political immortality in China. And he's doing everything he can to ensure that the party members remain loyal to the party. The party controls most aspects of life in China, and any sort of challenge to the party from within China would not actually be viable. So that's the second level of his accomplishment. And third, he wants to create a new narrative in China that would convince the Chinese people that China's day in the sun has arrived. He's elevated China to a new status in the global community. So these are all the things he's been trying. We don't know how, we can of course debate how successful he has been in achieving these three sets of goals. I would say that he's done remarkably well in achieving the first goal. It seems almost a foregone conclusion that he's going to stay on for another 5 years at least, if not more. The second one is much more debatable, whether the Communist Party's hold on power has been actually increased or weakened as a result of these changes. You can make a case on either side. And the third one, and I would say that's elevating China's global status is encountering very serious pushback from the incumbent superpower, the US, and of course, to a less extent, other Western countries. So that's still a work in progress.
When he's trying to achieve these goals, what would you say his greatest strengths are in trying to achieve these goals you've laid out?
Yes, I think when you look at these three sets of goals, his greatest strength is his control of the levels of power, the levels of coercion, or means of discipline or prosecution within the party. So in terms of getting rid of potential rivals, centralizing the decision-making process, and changing the rules of the game to ensure his political status and authority, he's done remarkably well. I don't think anybody could have imagined the kind of ease with which he succeeded in achieving this objective. In terms of the second sets of goals, that's making the party much more durable, more secure, more viable for the long run. It's much more difficult because the party is a very powerful organization. But then whether it succeeds in gaining social support, in sustaining the economy, in maintaining a peaceful or relatively benign external environment, there are a lot of other people, other actors that can cast a vote. So on this score, he has some influence. The party has some influence, but not complete influence. And then in terms of elevating China's international status, then China's power is even less abroad than it is at home. So I think on that issue, it's really a matter of influence and power. And at this moment, at least, China does not have sufficient capabilities to achieve the kind of ambition Xi Jinping would like to see.
And lastly, for you, Minxin, for now, what would you say his biggest challenges are in trying to achieve these, really quite ambitious goals?
Yeah, I think short-term and medium-term. Short-term, that he has to pull off a very successful party congress sometime in October or November this year. He wants to ensure that he has a very good story going into the Congress, and that means dealing with COVID in China. The Chinese economy is not going to do very well, as Zhiguo will probably give us more on the economic front. And he faces grumblings inside the party because he's going to, after all, break the term limit and stay on, and he has to at least make some gesture about the succession process. So this is actually a big challenge for him, is the party congress and succession. After all, he's almost 69, and he has about 10, 15 years of active political life left, and he has to do something for the party's future. And the other problem is really U.S.-China relations, because of the downturn in U.S.-China relations, it has changed everything in terms of China's economic development strategy. He's proposed a new development strategy that focuses much more on domestic growth and technological self-sufficiency. And we don't know whether it's going to be successful. So that's, and the third is, how can he maintain peace with the U.S.? It's a very dangerous situation on China's periphery. So he faces actually a quite daunting list of things to do.
I just want to, I know I said I was going to move on, but I really want to press you on one thing, which is fascinating for me. You think that he will come up with some sort of succession plan or some sort of announcement on, like, here's my Lin Biao or my, in this, at the 20th Congress? Or
I don't think so. I think there's certainly pressure within the Communist Party for some kind of clarity. But as far as a succession arrangement is concerned, we're going to see some ambiguity. We might see somebody who sounds like a plausible successor, but then you will also say, well, maybe not. So, yeah.
A Medvedev figure, yeah.
Yes, okay.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Minxin. And I'd like to move to Zhiguo, just to, I'd like to talk about the economy. It's what I've covered for the last 20 years or so, the Chinese economy. Now I'm in Europe. I don't think about it quite as much, but we've seen this really extraordinary crackdown on what are really the most innovative, exciting, world-beating companies, Alibaba, Tencent, really the technology companies which have set China, on a really sort of quite exciting path economically. But the Communist Party over the last year and a half or so has really cracked down on this. So what do you think is going on, first of all? And then how badly do you think this will impact sort of future growth? Because a lot of people, I remember, were arguing, well, they've got the Tencents and the Alibabas. These are going to replace, the new economy. This will replace the real estate sector, for example, and, the digitization and fintech. This is really the future. But the Communist Party seems to have cracked down on its most vibrant part of the modern Chinese economy. So what's going on, Zhiguo?
This has been at least 5 years, I guess. It's just last year, the 2020 November, right? That was coming out as a big news, a surprise to everybody that there's some biggest IPO ever will get on there, and 1 week before basically just cancel off in 1 minute. What's interesting is that this is really something like, in a way, that what Xi Jinping brought in is that he doesn't, in a way that he has a very predetermined rule that if something he smelled really wrong, and given all these accumulation of evidence, even if there are a lot of forces before it went to IPO, right? Ali did so much things, try to push on the table, and a lot of people thought that because we already did given there, then the top authority might say, okay, let's just, given whatever it is, and let's push it through. That's not the way that it happened. You see that changes, and in the top authorities' perspective now is basically that if you're trying to challenge some things, that we will let you see that who has the ultimate power. I think that in that sense, that I'm not trying to put it as like a politics conquering the economics. I want to tell you that this is a very, very well-defined economic question with a very clearly defined benefit and a cost. It's just that for a long while, the Ali probably, given what they're already good at it and accumulating a lot of resources, including politics, including economics, and making it through. They're doing so much great things to China, as you said, right? It's like becoming a national pride, to be honest, around 2015, 2016. I'm teaching Ali in my class. A lot of people taking my China class because of Ali. Think about it, right? That's something that has just become a name card for China. But we do know there are a lot of issues. Today's Caixin's, there's a new article coming from Caixin, was basically kind of a reporting on some questionable practice of this rankings of these financial products on their platform. All these issues that are, outside of China, everybody is looking at. And what happened is basically that the platform economy needs a regulation, and it's basically that Xi Jinping feel like this is the right time to crack on. This is the same thing as a housing. Housing is the same kind of issue that it's a cancer to Chinese economy. So then now you see that in the past 2 years, we are, China, Beijing is trying to deal with it. It's just really deal with it. There's no best way to deal with it. It's always ugly. Now, getting to your core question, which is that, is this like the end of the innovation? Far from truth, right? So you see that I was very, very worried about the initial cracking down. And the last year I was in China. I was having dinner with a bunch of young guys who were age of 30th. That is the best time for Chinese youngsters who, let's say, they have a great degree, they have all these connections, they have the resources, coming from, let's say, it's not Princeton, but a well-connected network. And often the time that they typically want to do some new entrepreneurs. And I was asking them, like, well, what do you do, right? It's like, now basically that you're not encouraged to do these type of things anymore. Now they actually tell me a very surprising result, a surprising answer that no. Now it's basically the so-called racetrack has changed. Previously, people get on the right racetrack, they get rich. Now we just need to find the right racetrack. And this is basically what the reports you saw from the Wall Street Journal as well as Bloomberg from a pre-chain data, which is the US-based data sets, tells you that in 2021, the VC money, including the foreign as well as Chinese domestic funding, reached the new high level, even exceeding 2019 data. That just, and then obviously you have to see these composition shift from these soft kind of innovation on consumer-based platform to the hardcore technology like biotech, those are 5G, chips, semiconductor, all these things. So I'm just telling you that there's a clear shift, and it seems like Beijing not to the best smooth transition I can ever hope, but seems okay at this point. There's a lot of issues to deal with. Housing, real estate market, it's far from clear, but it is not like a catastrophe that it typically, you saw in some medias.
Okay, well, I mean, I totally agree with you, I have to say, about the real estate sector being a cancer on the economy. I don't think you were saying Alibaba's a cancer on the economy, but yeah, so good. Well, we agree on that. I'd like to come back to the economy, and certainly there's quite a few questions coming in that we'll come back to it, because I certainly think there's more trouble ahead, but we can discuss that in a minute. I'd like to get back to Susan, and you started off, I believe, your career as a Sovietologist and someone who knows a lot about Russia. I know very little about Russia, but I'm fascinated and I'm obsessed by Russia. And right now, in my current role, I'm thinking about Russia and Ukraine, an enormous amount. And there are a lot of people here predicting that Russia is poised to invade Ukraine. There's some debate around whether China is at least tacitly sort of approving of that. What's fascinating to me is this relationship, and I sort of got at it a little bit before with the Sino-Soviet. We talked about Nixon, we talked about the Sino-Soviet split, and then the fall of the Soviet Union. Do you think that the relationship between China and Russia is more than just an anti-American alliance, that it maybe could be more durable in various ways?
It's definitely become a kind of anti-American alliance, but I guess we have to go back further. I mean, it's true that when Nixon and Kissinger went to China, the whole idea was that the US was trying to get itself into a position where we would have a better relationship with China and a better relationship with the Soviet Union than they had with each other. And that's an ideal position for us to be in. We're in the opposite of that now, of course, where we have a worse relation with both than they have with each other. And actually that is a factor in the relations between the two of them, that we're sort of pushing them together. And a lot of their common cause is made by, being against things that we're pushing. And I mentioned the sort of identification of the two of them as the primary autocrats that are sort of standing in the way of democratic resilience in the world. But it goes much further than that. And I think we have to be clear that there is a kind of a natural, there is both a natural kind of alignment and also a natural kind of suspicion. And, both of those are going to continue to be at work. But right now, the alignment is definitely a lot stronger. And, the alignment comes too in the way that their economies line up together. They're very compatible as far as Russia being a natural resource exporter, China being an importer. China's getting a lot of resources from Central Asia, has to keep good relations with Russia, I think, in order to keep that all those pipelines that they've built in Central Asia flowing for natural gas and oil and other resources. They are aligned in having created this Shanghai Cooperation Organization that deals with sort of the security issues on China's periphery that it's very worried about in terms of, and especially now in the post-Afghanistan environment, in terms of sort of extremism and other forms of instability on their periphery. They have a border with several of the Central Asian countries, and of course also with Afghanistan. So there are just a lot of things that they agree on, and also just the common heritage that comes from the sort of former Communist Party in the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party and all that history, some of it good, some of it tension-filled and rocky, but still there's a lot that they have in common. And I think especially in terms of sort of the way they see the international system and the deficiencies that they see in it right now, the straining against what they see as US hegemony and the imposition of constraints on them that they think are unfair, et cetera. So I don't think, though, and I guess I want to go back to one of the points that you made, I don't think the Chinese are tacitly encouraging Russia to invade Ukraine. I think the Chinese would be very much opposed to a military intervention in Ukraine by Russia. What they're trying to do right now is walk a very fine line, which they're probably not managing to do very well, which is to sort of not be in favor of any kind of military action, but at the same time try to represent that Russia's so-called legitimate security concerns need to be taken into consideration. And there, they do make a lot of common cause with Russia's complaints about the way the West has treated and kind of trampled all over Russian security interests. And China feels much the same way about its security interests being trampled over by the US in its own periphery. So that does give the two of them a lot of common cause, but the military intervention, I can't see the Chinese being in favor of that.
I want to ask you, Minxin, something that I've heard discussed a little bit, and I think even Henry Kissinger, although I think he publicly denied it, but according to sources I had, Henry Kissinger at one point proposed a reverse Nixon-Kissinger, basically trying to split Russia and China by getting closer to Russia. Do you think that's something that's even remotely, certainly not at the moment, but is that even remotely possible, Minxin, something you think anyone would seriously consider in the US?
You mean trying to split China from Russia, or from Russia from China?
By being friendly to Russia.
Oh, yes. Oh, it's not just a lot of people in the US have been talking about this. You've seen this written in some place like Foreign Affairs. I have always been quite skeptical about the doability, because this implies a fundamental misunderstanding of Russia, and it will come at a cost that is way higher than what the US paid 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you ask, what did the US actually pay? Very little, right? It simply reversed a set of policies that were not actually working very well, and it gained quite a bit. So today, if you want to,
it would cost Ukraine and maybe the Baltics.
Yeah, what the 50 years ago, what the US paid was this vaguely worded one China policy. That is, we acknowledge both sides, Chinese on both sides. It was very little. Today, if you want to get Putin away from President Xi Jinping, you actually have to pay a whole lot. You've got to basically do what Putin has demanded, reversal of Cold War, post-Cold War settlement. And that's not something the US is willing. So from very early on, I said, well, you can talk about this, but it's extremely unlikely.
Yeah. I want to ask you, and this gets back into the economy a little bit. What do you make of this common prosperities phrase that we're hearing a lot about? What does that mean for an average? I mean, this audience isn't average, but for an American audience, what does he mean with common prosperity?
Okay, I have looked at Xi Jinping's speech on this, at the government documents on this. At the most practical level, it has these elements. First of all, it wants to create better jobs, to create a larger middle class. Because right now, China may have, in absolute numbers, the world's largest middle class. But in terms of share of the population, it's still relatively small. It's fewer than 1/3, if not even less. So she wants to increase the size of the middle class. She also wants to expand access to public service, high quality service to people in the countryside. That's not controversial. And he also doesn't like the idea that you can, a small number of people can get incredibly rich. So he wants to limit the role of capital in creating ultra rich people. So these are all, I would say, in terms of theory or abstract thinking, these are all very good ideas. But the problem is, how do you go about doing this? This is where he is facing a lot of problems, because we should not forget, the richest people, a lot of them are Communist Party members. So you actually have to go after Communist Party members. And then China's inequality, a big part of it, if not the biggest part of it, is regional inequality, which means you've got to transfer wealth from places like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong, to places like Ningxia, Guizhou, Anhui. And that means a lot of regional conflict. So you, and at another technical level, you've got to fix the tax structure in China. Right now, the central government collects a lot of money, but does not cover a lot of local services. If you want to get real common prosperity, you've got to reduce the central government's intake. And that means going after your own people, going after Beijing itself. So it's a very good concept, but at the practical level, I just don't see how it can be achieved.
Zhiguo, what do you think? What is the point of common prosperity, or how achievable is that? For example, do you think the central government is planning another huge stimulus, something to really, build bridges to nowhere and things like that? Is that the solution? How do you achieve this idea of common prosperity, and what does it really mean?
So Minxin already mentioned this common prosperity. So I want to it's also related to this stimulus plan. So there are two parts of a common prosperity, if you think hard about it. It's basically saying that the rich guy needs to do something, and we need to do something for the really poor guy, right? So these two parts. Then that will bring the equality. On the do something for the poor guys, I think one thing that showed up in this stimulus, so-called new stimulus plan, if you follow the Chinese economy news really closely, you saw that this January total social finance, which is an index that keeping track of the China's economic activity very closely, you saw a big chunk of the investment through so-called local government special purpose bonds. There are about 10% of them going to this welfare housing. Welfare housing as to address the issue that there's in China, the housing prices are basically the private or truly commercial market price housing is it's just almost not bearable. For instance, I cannot buy a house in Beijing or Shanghai. I just cannot, even with my salary here. So you think about it at that level, then people still living and working in Beijing. There must be lots of welfare housing that are going on, have to be done. So that's part of the stimulus there. So this is a pretty good part of, I think everybody will support that. The other side of a common prosperity that Minxin didn't mention, at least it showed up in the first month right after this slogan of common prosperity, is some of the rich guys start to donating money to the universities or to donate to some rural country area where building more this entrepreneur training camps, all these type of things, where they basically kind of like has a little bit combination of politics and economics, and these rich people try to show that this is a part of the you can say the economic agenda that the current modern China is trying to achieve. There's a very important businessman in the VC industry that he is actually Yale alumni. Student might know Neil Shen. He's the biggest donor for the Yale Beijing Center. And I was yesterday watching all these things. I just saw that Neil was saying that, in the past 2 years, we were attracting lots of money to investing in these infrastructure or these like a new infrastructure investment, including the 5G, all these things. And even he admitted in the end saying that that's a lot of times it's not just for pecuniary, but it's also a part of the social agenda that we are trying to accomplish. Where in the time where we never unseen in the it's unseen in the past century, and we are trying to we are lucky to get into this time, and would like to see what could we bring to China in this new world. So those type of philosophy is always there, and I do feel like this is a you can say this is just a little bit weird version of a common prosperity. But I feel if you go back to China, seeing all these type of things, that's in a way that it's I would say it's it has a positive atmosphere brought into this society.
Jamil, can I just add a quick thought here, which is that, I look at the US-China relationship from sort of the US policy perspective, but one thing that kind of strikes you when you look at the challenges of China and the challenges of the US is that, it's kind of a competition on who can reform most effectively, because we keep talking about getting our own house in order and all our internal challenges. And one of the things the Chinese have done well for the last 40 years is be able to reform when they saw things that weren't going the right way. But, this common prosperity is going to be, as Minxin said, really difficult. And the first kind of casualty, and I'd be curious what Zhiguo thinks about this, but they were going to try to do a property tax, which they've been trying to do for decades. I mean, the other thing that's obvious is getting rid of the hukou system, which is this residence permit that doesn't allow services to be provided to all the migrants in the big cities. But you don't hear anything about these kind of fundamental, obvious things that need to be done because they're too hard, I think. And sort of, so, China's kind of gotten stuck in its reforms, and the US is obviously having a hard time finding its feet to reform. And it just reminds me of the old Brezhnev, treadmill of reforms when the Soviet Union couldn't reform. And is this where kind of we both are now? But I don't know if anyone has a reaction to that, but it just keeps coming up over and over again, how hard it is to change things.
Susan, you made a really great point. I was going to say these two things, but I thought that I already spoke too long. The first thing is about the housing tax. This will come. It's just not at the right time yet. So people see that it's put on the table twice. The first time that people talk about it, that's the end of 2018. And at that time that Trump did something, so then done. And then nobody talks again just because economic goes down. Then it's a right time right now. It's 2020 in the wake of this housing real estate cracking down, and I feel like that at this point is putting on the table again just because the regulators are seeing that it's probably too harsh, and then now it's just putting on the table. But I expected that next year the housing tax reform will come in again. Now that's the best way to bring the equality back. Now, how much that can do, that's the other question. The deepest issue is a hukou that I don't see it in the 20 years. Just because that's in a way that just China's supply. And then you really naked getting to the economic fundamental. What's the hukou it really brings you? One is education, the other is a medical. Those two things are the people who care most. And that's just the supply is not there yet. Everybody tried to get the best education. Everybody tried to get the best medical services, but just that's impossible. And then nowadays that China is doing this lottery system, that's very inefficient.
Yeah, I just add my slightly cynical view of common prosperity, which is I know some of the people I think Zhiguo, and I won't go into names, but most of the rich guys I know in China are quite scared. And I think they're preemptively trying to give money to sort of buy their freedom, maybe preemptively, and buy their safety, perhaps. For me, it's a very, they are very worried. And I hear a lot of people, maybe not the very big ones, because it's very hard for them to leave, but the sort of medium-sized fish, all trying to sort of get out, maybe at least get their assets. Many of them have assets out already, but get them and their families out even more now. There's a real kind of worry, I think, amongst, because one of the easiest ways to create common prosperity is not to lift up 1.2 something billion people, but to pull down, 10 million or so, just pull them down a little bit more. So certainly the people I've been talking to worry a lot about that. But
I definitely agree with you. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, as Susan said. It just gets to some fundamental reform. But I think hukou reform is way harder because now you're reforming some common guy, like normal guy, who feel like if they were born in Shanghai or Beijing, that's supposedly they're supposed to enjoy. But the rich guy, I feel that they would like to contribute a little bit. They have enough that those ones that I know that they feel like money is not the only thing they would like to. So by contributing, buy something that they might get to some place that they would eager to have.
Good. Well, I think we should turn a little bit to some of the audience questions. We've got lots of people on this call, more than 500, I think. So we won't be able to get to all of your questions, I'm afraid, but we'll try and get to some of them. So here's someone asking, Mark Johnson's asking, how does the US dollar reserve currency status and the large economic trade imbalance resolve? What does China want? in that. So you've got the reserves, and you've got these big imbalances, which have frankly gotten worse since the Trump deal. I notice that the trade imbalance is even worse. So how do you resolve this? Maybe Zhiguo, I'll ask you about that and see what you think.
Oh, there's the three questions, I guess. One is on this reserve currency. No way. It's just, calm down. US is gonna be another 100 years. It's related to this this common prosperity. Lots of rich people would like to get out. If there's no capital control, yes, it's like another Latin America, basically. People getting out, and once I see my friends get out, everybody try to get out. This is exactly the capital control. I do not see in the next 50 years that China will lift them. It's just that's the last important piece where the China can ensure their stability. That's one thing. The second one is trade. Trade thing is just trade deal. So many people were basically complaining to China again on Beijing didn't fulfill this promise, etc. And I was in a WeChat group with a bunch of Chinese economists saying that is this really because that China doesn't have enough intention to buy, or US doesn't have enough stuff to sell? This inflation stuff, or this oil, or these things. There's a interesting question to ask. These trading balance are just fundamentally, I do not think that's the right way to address the issue. It's become a very, very, in a way, it's like you want to achieve something that a high moral ground, then in the end you get to some very dirty trick, which nobody really will take that will take that serious. That's my view on this.
Okay, great. There's a question in here. Someone asking what is the hukou system? So I can tell you it's a household registration system. It's spelled HUKOU, and you can go and Google it, and you'll find out all about it. One I thought very good question here. So what do you think the Communist Party's 5 to 10 year plan is for the Western border regions and Xinjiang? So maybe for Minxin and for Susan, what do how do you think Xinjiang will look like in like 10 years, 15 years? Where do you think things are headed there? And yeah, that's a question. Good question.
Yeah. Well, first we need to get access to those documents. I think these are very highly classified, so we're not going to know exactly, but we can guess. I think China's goal is to make those regions, in particularly Xinjiang, more stable. Stable in the sense that there will be fewer violent attacks, much less public display of defiance and resistance in the form of the dress people wear, facial hair, or those religious practices. And I think China probably would like to reduce the number of people they keep in those camps, because that's very costly and it does not put them in a good stand. But they're going to the more efficient way, or the less controversial, or the less jarring way of maintaining stability might be the introduction and implementation of much more sophisticated system of social control, so that you have people who are you will have fewer people in those camps, but you're not going to have a lot of resistance and opposition, and certainly you're not going to have a lot of violence.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that and say that, we've seen this movie before in China. We've seen it in Tibet. And if you go back, we have the Beijing Olympics going on right now, but we had a Beijing Olympics going on in 2008. And at that time, you had sort of uprisings and a lot of clashes in Tibet. you know, the effort to assimilate Tibet into China has been actually a lot more in the focus of Beijing and international attention for a lot longer than Xinjiang, but it's a similar issue. And the assimilation efforts undertaken by the Chinese government have been a little bit different, you know, reasonably so, given that these two regions are very different, but it's still an assimilation effort, you know, moving people from remote areas where they can't be as easily, you know, scrutinized and under control, into apartment dwelling areas in cities where they can be monitored. And, you know, the whole issue of sort of infringing on cultural traditions is, you know, part of this, but it's more of a economic development plus assimilation, you know, sending people to the other parts of China to work, to be educated, sending cadres out from other parts of China to Xinjiang. And the assimilation effort is much more, I think, focused and urgent in the part of Beijing now. So whatever happens with the camps, I think this assimilation effort is probably going to be kind of become more kind of sophisticated and nuanced, but it's not going to go away. And eventually you'll see that this will just continue to be, as Minxin said, an effort to maintain stability and monitoring and control.
Yeah, let me just add, China has just appointed a new party chief who replaced the person sending to enforce those security measures. The new party chief is the former governor of Guangdong. So you can interpret this at least as a sign that the next guy, who is much more familiar with economic development, will probably prioritize economic development in Xinjiang. The other guy, the guy he replaced, was a law and order guy, was a former policeman, or at least a sort of a secretary of law, politics and law in Henan province. So we have two very different people. And the new guy probably, as I said, is going to focus much more on bringing up economic development in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me is it's quite hard to have sort of normalized relations with China when, you know, I mean, the State Department estimates something like 3 million people have been incarcerated in these camps based on nothing more than their ethnicity and their religion. I mean, a lot of people would say it's very difficult to have normal and very, you know, collegial, friendly relations with a state that is doing that. And, you know, I lived through what's happened in Hong Kong, and truly, I would say I wouldn't put it on the same scale as Xinjiang by any stretch, but the speed with which, you know, the democratic freedoms and the media freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of association were crushed almost overnight. It makes it, I think, also very hard, doesn't it, for Western liberal democracies to really have good, wholesome relationships with the current Communist Party.
Oh, absolutely. I think China clearly recognizes the current policy in Xinjiang is a liability. It needs an off-ramp, which will achieve outcomes that are very difficult to reconcile. One, it needs to make sure that tensions and repression level in Xinjiang is lower so that tensions with the West will be lower. But it does not want to, as a result of this change, go back to the previous years when there was a relatively high degree of violence, a lot of resistance, and Beijing felt that it was losing control. So that's second. Third is that it wanted to make sure that within the party, the policy was not denounced as a mistake, the previous policy. So these are very difficult outcomes to achieve altogether.
I've gotten quite a few questions here about Taiwan. So I want to ask, Susan, you've dealt with these, with China for so long, and as a diplomat, an American diplomat, if you had to guess, best guess, do you think that Xi Jinping would invade Taiwan? Will invade Taiwan?
Well, I guess it would depend. It depends on so many things. It's really hard to answer yes or no to that question. But if you're asking me if I think that China will invade Taiwan in the next, few years, I say no. But if you want me to elaborate, yeah.
I'd love you to elaborate. What would it take? So let's say it depends on a whole bunch of things. Of course, I agree. What do you think would be the necessary preconditions or necessary factors to convince either Xi Jinping or a successor or a rival to that this was a necessary step for them to take? What do you think the sort of critical things are?
Well, China's got a law that it passed in 2005 called the Anti-Secession Law. And it's stated pretty clearly there that if Taiwan goes for de jure independence, or if all hope of pursuing peaceful reunification is lost, then it's incumbent upon the Chinese government to do something about that, including up to and including the use of force. So I think those are the two, basically the two red lines. They're stated in Chinese law. The question really then is, what are they going to do if Taiwan doesn't declare or pursue clearly de jure independence, and if they haven't given up all hopes that they could get it back peacefully. I mean, that's where we are right now. And you see the pulling and hauling on both sides as all sides try to sort of move the status quo in their favor without crossing any red lines. And it's getting pretty tense and dicey, I think. And so, China doesn't want to have a military confrontation over Taiwan, either with the people on Taiwan or certainly with the United States and potentially its allies and partners in the region. So, the preference of Xi Jinping and everybody else is to, avoid a conflict, but persuade people on Taiwan that being part of China is, in their long-term interest. Of course, at the same time, they want to make sure that the people on Taiwan know that if they should somehow decide that being part of China is not in their long-term interests, China has something to say about that, and it's building up its military capability in order to have something to say about that. So that's the dilemma. But I think I go back to my earlier statement about what is China most focused on and most want. It wants stability. That's number 1, 2, and 3 in my view. And it wants economic development, which is related, of course, to the stability. And it wants respect. The Taiwan part of the equation comes in mostly, it's partly development, partly stability, but it's mostly coming through on the respect side and the reunification of the motherland, the restoration of historical China, et cetera, et cetera. So, respect is important, but it's maybe not as important as stability and economic development. And that's what we have to, I think, keep hoping is the case going forward, and that we can resolve this with wisdom and prudence, and that everybody tries to understand it's a serious and dangerous issue, and we shouldn't play games with it, which I think is sometimes, lost in the mix.
Thank you. Yeah. So a lot of questions are coming in about the aging population in China and the economic consequences of that. So I'd like to turn back to Zhiguo and ask how significant a sort of threat or challenge to China's future economic growth do you think the aging population? We've seen, I actually wrote the first story about shrinking working age population. That was back in, I guess, 2012 or 2011 even, when you started to see working age population had peaked and started to decline. And now we're pretty close, I think it depends on your estimates, but we're pretty close to absolute population decrease, and all of the aging, what the consequences of an aging population. How significant is that for the economy, and what will that mean?
It is a very concerning for the population aging issue. I want to make 2 points. One, the first point is relating to Taiwan. I saw in the discussion, there's one person making the comment saying that, oh, China doesn't want to go to war because of the aging population. That's just nonsense. It's just impossible to think about it that way. Aging population is probably 20, I guess that in the horizon of 2030, 2 decades kind of horizon. And obviously, Taiwan is perhaps is longer. I'm more optimistic than Susan on that. But I think the one who's playing fire is on the inside of the island, those independent parts, which is the instability part. On the population aging, the second point I want to make, BFI China at the University of Chicago was inviting an expert, Cai Fang. He was basically like authority on this issue. He was showing something quite interesting. He was showing that basically the labor supply, you need to think about both the quantity as well as the quality. And fortunately, the quality side, because of the education shift, in starting, perhaps 30 or 20 years ago, is that, once you multiply both, the quality times the quantity seems to be not that bad. Now, it is still dropping, and this is why that Beijing was pushing all the young couples to having more kids. At this point, not seeing immediate result yet, but all these social dynamics it's very hard to predict. But I do worry about this aging population, obviously. So I'm concurring Jamil's point.
Okay, and we've had a couple of questions about Iran. So, and Susan, you referenced Iran right at the start of the new axis of evil. Not your words, some of the views of some people in the establishment in the United States. What maybe for Minxin and for Susan, what do you think is the role of Iran for China? I mean, is just China see it as something it can sort of help it to sort of poke America with, or is it a really valuable ally, perhaps? Or what do you think?
Well, I'll start. I'll be curious to hear Minxin's view on this. I mean, I think that China has a lot of competing interests with respect to Iran. Certainly, China's, the Middle East is a really important region, increasingly important region for China, given how much of its sort of energy source is coming from there. They've tried to diversify. They're continuing to try to diversify, but they get a lot of oil from the Middle East, and in particular Iran. And of course, they also have a very big interest in nuclear non-proliferation. So they do not favor the development of a nuclear weapons program in Iran. And they've been working closely with the US and the other partners on that agreement back when the Obama team negotiated it, and now when we're trying to resuscitate it. They've got a pretty interesting relationship, though, also with Israel. So, they have to walk a lot of lines in their dealings with Iran. I think they probably see that Iran, though, is a very important player in the Middle East, and they're going to maintain good relations if they can, to the extent they can. They're not going to try to violate sanctions or do anything that would jeopardize their own interests for the sake of Iran. And they do have certain problems with certain aspects of Iran's behavior. So, and they don't like, I'm sure, a lot of the risk-taking sort of military side behavior that they see from Iran. So they have a complicated path, but they think Iran is important, and they're not going to ignore it or jeopardize their relations with it for sure.
I agree with Susan. China is walking a very fine line because of its competing interests. China has very good relations with Saudi Arabia, with Gulf countries, and with a decent relationship with Israel. China, at the same time, also sees Iran's strategic value as a player that could tie down significant US resources. So China's policy is to give Iran enough support so that Iran can stand up to the US, but not too much support, so much support that China will alienate its other friends and partners. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act.
Can I add just
yeah, go
one
ahead.
thing is basically that usually, you see that all these actions coming from the so-called sanction. The sanction from the typical Chinese eyes, that's exactly what a hegemony of the US and its allies are. And I just want to throw this out to saying that, here is talking about effective sanction, while the other side is seeing it as just a bullying. So those type of issues, it's so so pressing that I see both sides, and I do not have a good answer to it. This is Minxin, you might want to say, add on something.
No, I like the semantics. So when the US and its allies impose economic sanctions, they are sanctions. If China bullies other countries, it's economic coercion. So I see this as quite funny in terms of language.
Well, if China would do their coercion transparently and put it sort of state it openly, then we could call it sanctions too.
Sanctions,
nice.
Yeah.
China denies it's doing any coercion. That's true. So very important point. It says to this day, yes, we're doing. No, we're not doing it. I mean, it's not. It doesn't fit the self-image, I suppose. Still to this day, says it's not coercing Australia or Lithuania. It denies. How dare you even say that? But at the same time, they clearly are. So that's a very important distinction. Thank you. I'm interested in what all of you think about, and there's a question here about this, a couple of questions about One Belt and One Road. Where are we in that? I mean, what I've moved to this part of the world. It's something that people talk about a lot, but others sort of dismiss. Where do you think we're at? Is it so far a success, a failure, or a sort of bit of both? What do you think, Minxin? I'll start with you, and then
I think it began as a boondoggle. It is on life support. I think we paid way too much attention. We read way too much strategic intent into this. Belt and Road does not have a lot of domestic support. It is seen within the Chinese bureaucracy mostly as an opportunity to fatten your budgets. If you put anything under that rubric, you're going to get support. And it has made a lot of mistakes. And the chickens are coming home to roost. We're going to see a dramatic refocusing of Belt and Road. It will be much more close. I think its new projects will be around China's periphery, strategically important areas. I think the irony is that Belt and Road, as it started, was a boondoggle, and now as it restructured, it will bear very little resemblance to its original design. The so-called high-quality Belt and Road actually will have a lot of strategic value to it. I'm not going to say it's not on life support. It is being transformed.
Dissenting opinions. We've got basically out of time, but any dissenting opinions for that?
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I agree with what Minxin says, and I think, I mean, the U.S. is in the developed world. I mean, in a way, we've made this too much of a bogeyman, and it hasn't worked out well for us. I would say we should have just let, sleeping dogs lie and let it take the course it's taken. But I would say that we should not make the mistake of underestimating the appeal of what China's been doing in a lot of places in the developing world. And I look at what China's doing as a leader of the developing world and the sort of diplomatic economic capital it's willing to spend on, paying attention to this part of the world, the vaccine diplomacy in this part of the world. And I do worry that we just kind of dismiss it. I do think that this is kind of compelling in that part of the world, and that we in the US and elsewhere in the developed world risk kind of underestimating, as George W. Bush might have said, what is happening in terms of China's influence in the developing world. Maybe we don't mind, or maybe it's a good division of labor or whatever. That's not the narrative that you hear. And I don't like the geopolitical competition being the cause of our diplomatic attention to the developing world. I think we need to figure out what's going, to pay more attention to these different parts of the world for their own sake, and not because of what China's doing there. But I think we think China's got a bad rap in these places, and I think that we don't have a very accurate picture of the narrative out there.
It's a very good and important point, and I think it's a very good moment to stop and to thank the panelists who, such a distinguished group and such a eloquent group. So thank you so much. Allowing me personally, I'm very grateful that I could reconnect to China at least for an evening before I have to go back. The oddity and anarchies of the European Union and Russia and Ukraine and all the rest. And but thank you so much to the three of you. Thank you so much to Chicago Booth for letting me join as the moderator. And I hope to see you all in Brussels, the panelists and other guests, of course. And thank you very much. And have a nice day wherever you are.
Thank you, Jamil.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Susan. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.